He wanted obedience. He got resistance. She was supposed to be just another statistic, but instead, a black woman's courage turned humiliation into history, exposing a system built on silence. He thought she was just another black woman he could silence with a badge. But what Mark Whitfield didn't know was that Aaliyah Carter carried more strength, honor, and resilience than he'd ever be able to break. By the time he dragged her into that cold jail cell, the very career he built on intimidation was already crumbling. The road was almost empty that late night outside Jackson, Mississippi. Rain from an earlier storm still clung to the asphalt, and the street lamps flickered with the kind of eerie glow that made every shadow look alive. Aaliyah Carter had been driving for nearly 2 hours, returning home after visiting her younger sister. Jazz hummed softly from the speakers, a familiar tune her father used to play when she was a girl. She tapped her fingers gently on the steering wheel, humming along. She wasn't in uniform. No one looking at her would have guessed she had served nearly 15 years in the Navy, earned commendations, and risen to the rank of lieutenant commander before returning to civilian life. Tonight, she was just Aaliyah simple sweater, jeans, her braids pulled back neatly. She blended into the night, or so she thought. The flashing red and blue lights appeared suddenly in her rearview mirror. Her stomach tightened not with fear, but with the weary recognition of what was about to unfold. She had been through this before, like too many black drivers in the South. She sighed, flicked on her signal, and eased her car onto the shoulder of the road. The patrol car rolled up close behind her. It sat there for a moment, engine idling, headlights glaring in her mirrors. She placed the car in park, took a slow breath, and set both hands on the wheel where they could be seen. Military training had taught her discipline, caution, and control, and she knew all too well how fragile these encounters could be. When the officer stepped out, his boots scuffed against the wet pavement. He walked slowly, deliberately, the way a man moved when he expected instant obedience. In the glow of the flashlight he flicked on, Aaliyah saw the name glinting on his badge. Whitfield, license and registration. He barked, no greeting, no explanation. His voice was flat, practiced, impatient. Aaliyah glanced at him through the side mirror. Calmly, she reached for the glove compartment, her movements slow and deliberate, and handed him the documents. "Was I speeding, officer?" she asked, her tone steady. Whitfield didn't answer right away. He held her license just out of reach, leaning in to peer inside her car as if searching for trouble. Then his lips curled into a smirk. Tail lights out. Her brows knit together. "That can't be right. I just had them checked a few weeks ago." Whitfield tilted his head, his smirk widening. "Are you arguing with me?" That silence, the heavy pause where power hangs in the air, settled between them. Aaliyah had felt it before. Overseas, in military briefings, on bases where split-second decisions could mean life or death. She knew this wasn't about a broken taillight. It was about power, about control, about whether she would yield. "I'm just saying," she replied carefully. "I'll get it checked if there's a problem." "Step out of the car." Whitfield cut her off, voice sharp. Her hands tightened on the wheel. "Mind telling me why?" He tilted his head, his smirk curling into something darker. "Because I said so." Aaliyah exhaled slowly, her breath fogging faintly in the cool night air. She unbuckled her seatbelt, opened the door, and stepped onto the pavement. Her posture was relaxed, but her presence carried weight. She wasn't looking for a fight, but she wouldn't be bullied either. Whitfield stepped closer, flashlight beam grazing across her chest, then down to her hands. He sized her up, like a predator circling prey. "Turn around," hands on the car. She hesitated, her voice calm but firm. "For what reason?" His smirk dropped. He leaned closer. "Are you resisting?" "No. I'm asking a question." That flicker in his eyes, half annoyance, half amusement, was one she had seen before in men who thought their authority was untouchable. Without warning, he raised his radio and muttered, "We got a non-compliant driver here." Then louder, "Turn around." Her pulse quickened, but her face stayed composed. "Officer, I need you to understand something," she said, her voice low but unshaken. "I know exactly what my rights are, and I know exactly what you cannot do." Whitfield's jaw tightened. He didn't like that. His hand shot out for her wrist. Aaliyah moved back just enough to avoid his grip. "Under arrest. For what?" "For obstructing an officer," he snapped, snapping open his cuffs. Her breath escaped sharply through her nose. She knew the game now. He was escalating, betting she would break. But she had been trained for worse than this. She turned slowly, deliberately placing her palms on the cool roof of her car. The metal grounded her steady against her skin. Whitfield yanked her arms behind her and locked the cuffs tight to tight. Pain flared at her wrists, but she held her silence. He shoved her toward the patrol car, muttering, "You don't know what you're doing." Aaliyah murmured back, voice calm, "Neither do you." He chuckled darkly as he shoved her into the back seat. "Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing." But he didn't. Not even close. As the patrol car pulled away, the red and blue lights staining the wet road behind them. Aaliyah sat straight, wrists burning, her reflection faint in the partition glass, calm on the outside, fire simmering within. She had faced combat overseas. She had led sailors through crises. She had stared down chaos before. But this was different. This was a man with a badge, drunk on authority, convinced he was untouchable. And he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The holding area smelled faintly of sweat, disinfectant, and old coffee. The fluorescent light above buzzed and flickered, casting a cold pallor over the concrete walls. Aaliyah Carter sat on the hard metal bench, cuffs finally removed but wrists still red and burning. The steel bars clanged shut behind her, and Sergeant Mark Whitfield lingered just long enough to let his smirk settle into her memory. "Enjoy your stay," he muttered, tapping the bars with 2 fingers before strutting away. Aaliyah exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders back. She had been in darker places, foreign bases during wartime. Makeshift quarters in lands where every shadow could conceal an enemy. This, she told herself, was nothing. But that didn't mean she wasn't angry. This wasn't a battlefield. This was supposed to be home. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, breathing slow and deliberate. Control the breath, control the mind. Basic training. Her calm wasn't weakness, it was her shield. She knew the real battle was about to begin. And it wouldn't be fought with fists or weapons. It would be fought with patience, truth, and the power of exposure. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. She didn't even have to see him to know it was Whitfield. That arrogant stride was unmistakable. He appeared in front of the cell, arms folded across his chest, his badge catching the sickly light. "Comfy?" he asked, his tone dripping with mockery. Aaliyah raised her eyes to meet his. Her face was calm, her lips curved ever so slightly. "I'm exactly where I need to be." The smirk faltered just for a flicker of a second, but it was there. A crack in his armor. Whitfield leaned closer to the bars, lowering his voice. "If you'd just played along, you wouldn't be here right now. That attitude of yours, it'll ruin you." She tilted her head, unshaken. "Or, it'll ruin you." For the first time that night, his eyes narrowed with something other than nascency. He covered it quickly with a scoff and stepped back, but Aaliyah had seen it. She had rattled him. Moments later, another officer appeared at the far end of the hall. Younger, nervous, carrying a clipboard. He hesitated before speaking. Sergeant Whitfield, we got a call. You should probably hear this." Whitfield turned, annoyance flaring in his jaw. "I'm busy." The young officer shifted his weight. "It's from higher up. They're asking about her." He nodded discreetly toward the cell. Aaliyah didn't move, but her pulse steadied with quiet satisfaction. Word was spreading. The system that Whitfield thought he owned was bigger than him, and somewhere beyond these walls, the truth was already working its way in. Whitfield muttered something under his breath and stormed away, his boots striking hard against the concrete. Aaliyah leaned back against the cold wall, closing her eyes briefly. She thought of her father, who had marched in civil rights protests decades earlier, reminding her as a child that dignity was its own weapon. She thought of her sailors, the ones who had looked to her for steady leadership in moments of chaos. She thought of every young black boy and girl who deserved to know that silence wasn't the only option. She whispered to herself, almost like a vow, one night, that's all it will take. And as the sounds of hushed voices carried down the hallway, Whitfield arguing, his authority, unraveling, Aaliyah knew the tables were already beginning to turn. Morning light poured through tall courthouse windows, painting golden stripes across the polished oak floor. The air inside carried a hush of anticipation, punctuated by the shuffle of papers and the low hum of murmurs from those waiting to see what would unfold. Aaliyah Carter stood near the defendant's table, her posture straight, her presence commanding even without her uniform. She wore a simple navy blazer and crisp white blouse, and though the fatigue of the night still pressed faintly on her, her eyes burned clear and steady. Her attorney, Carla Whitman, sat beside her. Flipping through documents with precise efficiency, Carla was the kind of woman who didn't waste words. Every movement had purpose, every glance calculated. Aaliyah liked that. She needed steady hands at her side today, though she was more than capable of standing alone. The heavy wooden doors creaked open, and Mark Whitfield entered the room. He carried himself as if the badge still made him invincible, shoulders squared, jaw tight, chin raised. Yet Aaliyah caught it immediately, that subtle stiffness in his step, that fleeting shadow behind his eyes. Arrogance had been cracked by the night before. Their eyes met across the room. Whitfield looked away first. The judge entered. Dallin Kirkland, an older man with lines carved deep into his face, the kind of lines that come from years of hearing stories of both truth and deceit. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and spoke in a weary but commanding voice. "All right, let's get to it." The prosecutor stood, a middle-aged man with neatly combed hair and a voice that cut clean through the air. "Your Honor, we have reason to believe Lieutenant Commander Aaliyah Carter was unlawfully detained without probable cause. Furthermore, we've uncovered disturbing patterns of misconduct tied to the arresting officer, Sergeant Mark Whitfield." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Whitfield shifted uncomfortably. Judge Kirkland peered over his glasses. "Sergeant Whitfield, care to explain?" Whitfield leaned forward, voice firm, trying to reclaim authority. "Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop. She argued, resisted, and escalated the situation." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "Uncooperative? Let's review her record, shall we?" He lifted a folder. Graduate of the Naval Academy, 15 years of service, multiple commendations, no criminal history, no outstanding citations, not even a parking ticket. And yet, you claim she was such a threat that you had to arrest her over. What was it? He flipped the page. A broken taillight, gasps broke out. Whitfield's mouth opened, then closed. Silence fell heavy. The prosecutor pressed on, voice sharp. "And there's more. An internal review of your arrest history, Sergeant, shows a disproportionate number of traffic stops involving black drivers. Far more than statistical average. This isn't coincidence, it's a pattern." The murmurs grew louder, angry now. Aaliyah sat still, her face calm, but her chest rose with a quiet pride. This wasn't just her fight anymore. This was bigger. Judge Kirkland set down his file with a thud. "Sergeant, I don't like what I'm hearing." Whitfield crossed his arms, defensive. She resisted. The prosecutor didn't flinch. "Bodycam footage says otherwise." A screen lowered at the front of the courtroom. The video played. There was Whitfield's voice, sharp and impatient. There was Aaliyah's voice, respectful. The escalation, the tightening of cuffs, the smug arrogance. The room watched, silent, as truth unfolded frame by frame. When it ended, the silence was suffocating. Judge Kirkland leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Sergeant Whitfield, you violated protocol. You conducted an unlawful arrest, and you failed to report the full details honestly. The charges against Lieutenant Commander Carter are dismissed." His gavel struck hard against the wood. "And I strongly recommend an internal investigation into your conduct." The sound cracked. Through the air, like thunder, the tension snapped. Whitfield's face flushed deep red, his jaw tight as stone. He looked like a man whose entire world had just tilted beneath his feet. Aaliyah stood, gathering her papers calmly. She glanced toward him one last time. Their eyes met, and no words passed between them. They didn't need to. The power had shifted. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. Reporters clamored for comment. Microphones pushed forward. Aaliyah didn't linger. She gave one statement, her voice steady and clear. No one, no matter their badge, has the right to abuse their power. Accountability isn't optional, it's necessary. If we want safe communities, we must demand justice, not intimidation. Words rippled through the crowd, carried by airwaves before the evening was done. The story was no longer about a broken taillight. It was about something far bigger. The courthouse steps were nearly empty by the time Aaliyah Carter finally slipped away from the flashing cameras and relentless questions. The crisp Mississippi air felt lighter on her skin, as if the weight of the past 24 hours had finally started to lift. She paused on the sidewalk, watching the swirl of cars and people downtown. And for the first time since that night on Highway 31, she allowed herself a long, steady breath of freedom. Inside, Mark Whitfield's career was unraveling. The headlines were already spreading. Sergeant suspended amid allegations of misconduct. The footage had gone viral. Community leaders were calling for deeper investigations into traffic stop disparities. The badge he had wielded like a weapon was now nothing more than evidence in a case against him. But for Aaliyah, the story wasn't about one man's fall. It was about what came next. That evening, she found herself sitting in a quiet cafe, tucked into the corner of downtown Jackson. Her hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee as the rain tapped gently against the windows. Across the room, a mother sat with her young son who was laughing at something small, carefree, in a way only children could be. Aaliyah's lips curved into a faint smile. She hadn't just fought for herself. She had fought for him. For every child who deserved to grow up in a world where power couldn't be abused unchecked. Her phone buzzed. A message from Carla, her attorney, Whitfield suspended. Internal affairs digging deep. This isn't over, but today, you won. Aaliyah set the phone down, staring out at the city lights flickering against the wet pavement. She thought of the countless names, those who hadn't had the rank, the connections, the voice to push back. She thought of every black man and woman who had been silenced, dismissed, or worse, just because someone with a badge believed they could. Tonight, for once, the script had flipped. The following week, the mayor's office invited her to speak. At a community forum, the auditorium was filled. Neighbors, activists, police officers, veterans, students. Aaliyah stood on the stage, her blazer crisp, her voice strong. "I didn't ask for what happened to me," she began, her eyes sweeping the room. "But I refused to be silent about it. Because silence only protects the people who abuse power. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to stand firm, even when fear is loud. And today, I stand not for myself, but for every person who's been told they don't matter. You do matter. We all do." The crowd rose to their feet, the sound of applause rolling through the room like thunder. For many, she wasn't just Aaliyah Carter, Navy officer. She was proof that resilience could turn pain into power. Weeks later, reforms began. Mandatory bias training, transparent reviews of traffic stops, a civilian oversight board for the police department. Small steps, perhaps, but steps nonetheless sparked by one night, one woman, and one refusal to back down. Aaliyah never thought of herself as a hero. She was simply someone who believed in accountability, someone who had spent her life serving a country that often tested her loyalty. And yet, as she walked down her street one warm evening, neighbors waved, children called her name, and people she had never met stopped her to say thank you. She smiled, not out of pride, but out of hope, because the fight wasn't over, it never would be, but now more people understood what was at stake. And as she stood on her porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Aaliyah whispered words she knew to be true. "Power unchecked is power." abused, but when ordinary people stand up, the system has no choice but to change. Her story became more than a headline. It became a call, a reminder that justice isn't something handed down, but something fought for. So if her journey made you think, if it made you feel the spark of courage inside, don't let it stop here. Share her story. Keep the conversation alive, and above all, don't forget to subscribe, because there are more stories waiting. Stories that prove again and again that resilience can break chains, and that hope, even in the darkest night, can light the way forward.